Welcome to our podcast where we discuss all things history. I'm Xavier, your host for today. For today's episode, the topic that our viewers requested is investigate the factors that led Japan to launch the attack on Pearl Harbour in 1941 and its consequences for the broader Pacific theatre of World War II. They sure love their two-part questions, don't they? We are also joined by two special guest speakers, so without further ado, let's introduce them.
Hi, I'm Asta.
Hello, Pauliina here.
To begin, I shall give the briefest of overviews to get our audience on the same page. On the 7th of December 1941, Japan launched simultaneous attacks on multiple locations such as Hawaii, British Malaya, and the Philippines. Their operations were mostly successful and so rapid that the Japanese themselves were surprised. This also violated Japan's traditional principle of fighting one enemy at a time, such as in the Russo-Japanese and Sino-Japanese wars. So, why would Japan pick a fight against the British and the US when the conflict in China was still ongoing? And to re-emphasize today's question, why attack Pearl Harbour?
To briefly state one main reason, Japan was eyeing resources in Southeast Asia, and to successfully conquer the region, they had to knock out the United States Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbour. Japan had a significant lack of economic or strategic resources, in particular oil, since the start of the 20th century. When oil was adopted as a naval fuel in 1906, Japan's domestic petroleum resources were deemed sufficient, but as early as 1909, increased naval and industrial demand started to pose problems for the Navy. In fact, their domestic peak oil was in 1915, and in 1916 they had to enter agreements with the Anglo-Saxon Petroleum Company for purchase of oil from North Borneo fields, marking start of naval interest in Southeast Asian resources. The dependency on foreign oil could only increase, and their synthetic fuel program had a paltry output of 10 to 11,000 tons per month. By comparison, Washington Treaty area estimations placed wartime fuel consumption at 3 million tons per year. Japan was highly dependent on the United States for oil, as the United States constitute 80 to 90% of their supply. In general, many American imports such as scrap, machine tools, were important economic inputs for Japan. Hence, when the American trade restrictions were gradually placed on oil refining equipment, aviation fuel, etc., Japan's ability to sustain its economy or wage war was hit hard. In August 1940, Navy brass concluded that Japan could not fight for more than a year given current oil reserves.
Wow, that must have been a bleak situation for Japan. But as far as I'm aware, Pearl Harbour doesn't have oil deposits, so how is it part of a bigger strategy in Southeast Asia and the Pacific?
There is no oil there, but across Southeast Asia there was oil and other valuable resources. For example, Malaya and the Philippines provided 50% of Japan's iron ore imports in 1937. Other imports from the region include coal, tin, and rubber, and perhaps most prominently, the Dutch East Indies provided 20 to 25% of Japan's oil imports from 1932 to 1936, second to the United States. Hence, it was not realistic to expect a perfect autarky without reliance on Southeast Asia for needed materials, and Japan saw it necessary to bring the region into their economic sphere to contribute to self-sufficiency. To me, that's a fancy way to phrase conquer for resources. In mid-1940, the fall of France and Netherlands revealed an opportunity to seize Southeast Asia. In the face of the economic sanctions and relatively low reserves, an attack to secure these resources seemed to be Japan's best chance. However, it was impossible to limit operations in the Indies to just Dutch force alone, and it was inevitable that the British, the Americans, and the Dutch would all be involved. In particular, Japanese Navy was concerned with the likelihood of a protracted war with the United States.
Is it just me, or do I sense some circular reasoning from the Japanese and the Navy here? They want and need oil, but after the sanctions, could not get it from the US, so they attacked the Indies to secure the oil. But in doing so, Japan will have to wage war against the US too, and they need the oil fields to even stand a chance?
Yes, great observation. Mark Petty and David Evans did point that out several times in their book too, and yes, the attack was to support their southern operations. The extremely imminent resource crisis that the Japanese were facing essentially put them on a timer. Hence, they thought that a decisive first strike against the United States was important if the two countries were to be at war. A series of lightning blows would even out the odds and be the basis of negotiated peace. Stretched to the limit by Japan across the Pacific, Germany and Italy across the Atlantic, it was thought the United States would be glad to reach a settlement advantages to Japan. The first lightning blow against the United States would be a surprise attack against the United States Pacific Fleet. In May 1940, the Pacific Fleet was moved from San Diego, California to Pearl Harbour, which made the fleet a possible target. This attack would break American morale, contributing towards the negotiated peace, prevent American offensive operations on Japanese home islands, and interference with Japanese plans in Southeast Asia to control key resources. Yamamoto Isoroku was a main proponent of the attack at Hawaii, although most other Navy staff were on board initially. As late as the beginning of 1941, the Navy still planned to use its traditional defensive strategy, where attacks on the Philippines would lure the Pacific Fleet outward. The fleet would be vetoed by air and submarine attacks, then decisively destroyed by the main force of the combined fleet. Yamamoto and some other senior officers had criticism regarding the traditional doctrine. Eventually, after several developments, including Yamamoto's threat to resign, his plan was approved by Navy General Staff.
Thank you for the insight on the road to Pearl Harbor, Asta. I agree that this shortage of resources, especially one as critical as oil, is a factor in their attack. However, my view is the scarcity was merely the tip of the iceberg, and there were decades of prior developments that resulted in this casus belli. Japanese militarism, nationalism, and imperial ambitions leading to a breakdown in foreign diplomacy played a big part in the road to Pearl Harbor and the Pacific War. In fact, I would even argue that this chain of events is the foremost reason that led to Pearl Harbor. To discuss Japan's transformation into an imperial power, let's go back in time towards the late 19th and early 20th century. In the wake of the Meiji Restoration, a newly industrialized Japan sought to increase their standing and influence on a regional and global scale. For example, the gunboat diplomacy that was exacted upon Japan in the Perry expedition was now used by Japan, leading to the Kanwa Treaty of 1876. From 1897 to the start of the Russo-Japanese War, more than half of the national budget was allotted to the military, and Russia's defeat saw Japan gain great respect internationally. Furthermore, during World War I, Foreign Minister Kato Komei and the High Command had formulated secret and grandiose war aims that anticipated Japan's strategic expansion during the late 1930s. All of China was to become a protectorate, the Russian sphere of interest was to be pushed back, and the Dutch East Indies was to be taken over. Daily life saw an increase in nationalism and indoctrination. By the end of the Meiji era, the state had total control of education, enabling inculcation of nationalist values. The symbol of the emperor and slogans such as "catch up, overtake" and "rich nation, strong army" prompted nationalism. In the military, indoctrination centered on cultivating Bushido and the spirit of Japan, which connoted racial superiority and a sense of invincibility. Another important and impactful event in Japan was Emperor Hirohito's enthronement and corresponding celebrations. Held in 1928, the celebrations were set against a background of literary and artistic representations of Russo-Japanese triumph and played a major role in enticing people to the side of the emperor and the state. Furthermore, many Japanese became more strongly convinced of their innate moral superiority as a people and race. The emotions of the rights countered pacifism, strengthening Hirohito's double image as living deity and supreme commander of the armed forces. According to Herbert Bix, the political activities of Hirohito and the court group relaunched monarchy in ways that gave a more militaristic configuration to Japanese nationalism. These events and developments transformed the national psyche of Japan, pushing them to generally become more militaristic and inclined towards expansion in Asia and conflict with the Western powers.
From your sharing, what happened in Japan seems to have some parallels with the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy during the same period as well.
Indeed, but as Herbert Bix wrote, these Japanese developments and whether they can be regarded as a part of the worldwide fascist phenomenon remains contested. The deification of the national racial community through this embodiment in a cult figure, militarism, dictatorship were some common elements between the Axis powers. Alongside these changes in Japanese society and ideology since the Meiji era, and possibly also due to them, the Japanese military eventually was much less subordinate to civilian authority. Their political influence and effects on Japan's national trajectory are significant and worthy of consideration in today's episode. The military was guaranteed the right of being able to interfere in legal politics, as every cabinet also had a military officials due to the army and navy ministers being appointed from a pool of senior officers. Even during the Meiji era, the military was already relatively independent, and that was never checked. During Hirohito's regency, the army sought to further the independence, and Army Minister Ugaki used a special imperial lecture to influence Hirohito against civilian control. During Hirohito's reign, this issue would only worsen. In 1930, both Army and Navy general staffs were fiercely at odds with service ministers over the issue of continued arms reduction and stagnating military allocations. The press had begun to build popular support for the military's right of supreme command, and the army as an institutional entity showed signs of marching out of control. By the summer of 1931, the highest leaders of the army were campaigning against arm reduction.
The Manchurian invasion took place in 1931. Would that happen to be related?
Yes, in fact, that is the next thing I was going to bring up. Makino Nobuaki, a Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, a direct personal advisor to the emperor, was informed in June 1931 about rather considerable plans for Manchuria that are being prepared by the military. In July, confrontations between the Japanese and Chinese escalated, and junior officers issued St. Genro Sayonji a private manifesto which affirmed that the Showa restoration means the overthrow of political party government. For those unaware, Genro were elder statesmen serving as informal advisors. That was an audacious act which reflected the ongoing breakdown in military discipline and hierarchical order. When Hirohito questioned Army Minister Minami about the state of the military discipline, Minami said he believes that diplomacy should be conducted as a national policy by foreign ministry officials and shall caution junior officers about this. The reality was Minami was aware of the Kwantung Army's secret plans in Manchuria and Inner Mongolia.
That does drive home the point about the military spiraling out of civilian control. Even the emperor did not know about military plans and was being lied to. So much for the emperor being the supreme commander of the armed forces.
Minami then warned the senior officers who were aware of the plot, and they decided to act more cautiously. Eventually, LT Colonel Ishiwara Kanji and Colonel Itagaki Seishiro commenced their plans. The Kwantung Army would completely overturn cabinet policies and undermine the emperor's authority. On the 18th of September 1931, a staged detonation near the Japanese-controlled South Manchurian railway line gave the Kwantung Army pretext to attack. The Manchurian incident eventually led to Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi permitting Manchuria to become an independent state, Manchukuo. Inukai had his hands tied in this decision, as the greater part of Japanese press and public and his war minister Araki Sada were in favor of what the army was doing in Manchuria. The incident also led to Japan's withdrawal from the League of Nations on 27 March 1933, as the League, by 42 votes to 1, adopted the Lytton Report denying recognition to Manchukuo and mildly criticizing Japanese aggression.
Earlier on, Asta mentioned that Japan was embargoed. Was that due to the Japanese aggression in Manchuria, China, or other parts of Asia? I suppose few nations would be fond of that.
That is precisely my argument. Japanese aggression in the 1930s started in Manchuria and continued into the 1940s, eventually spreading across Asia. That was made possible by both the military and civilian government, including Hirohito, even if he did not sanction initial action in Manchuria. He did accept the Mukden incident as fait accompli and was not significantly opposed to expansion that involved a brief usurpation of his authority if it was successful. Furthermore, the insubordinate personnel were lightly punished at best. Even from this, we can observe that he and the government were complicit in Japanese expansionism, not solely a rogue military.
Speaking of rogue military, didn't Japan at the time have many attempted coups and assassinations of prominent businessmen and officials, even prime ministers?
Indeed, there were. For instance, the May 15 incident in 1932 saw both Navy and Army officers, in conjunction with civilians, assassinate Prime Minister Inukai. This act was underpinned by the ratification of the London Naval Treaty that would limit the Imperial Japanese Navy. The perpetrators are got off with relatively light punishments, and many even petitioned for a reduction in sentences. And on February 26, 1936, another coup attempt comprising over 1,000 armed soldiers was ultimately foiled. They sought to overthrow the political order and appoint as Prime Minister General Masaki, the hero whom mutinous trusted to strengthen the military and resolve the China problem. I would consider such events as symptoms of the fanatical militarism that had taken root throughout Japan.
Wow, that's insane. The nationalistic militarism had such severe implications for both their domestic and international affairs. It's an understatement to say that I would not want to live in that era.
The China problem brings me to the next part of my point. Their earlier campaign in Manchuria led to a series of minor conflicts, including the He-Umezu Agreement in June 1935, where Chiang Kai-shek yielded to the Japanese and withdrew forces from the Beijing-Tianjin area. And ultimately, the final spark was the Marco Polo Bridge incident in July 1937, where Japanese army units clashed with Chinese garrison forces. Unlike the Mukden incident, it was not an accident. Both government and the Japanese general staff were convinced that rapid and total victory was possible. Hence, Japan committed more troops to achieve a final solution to the China problem, and it was only a matter of weeks before the incident became a campaign. As we may already know, the conflict in China persisted until 1945. From the Mukden incident in 1931 to the agreement in 1935, to the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War and beyond, diplomatic tensions between the US and Japan would only further increase until the outbreak of hostilities. The Nanjing Massacre, or the Japanese sinking of US Panay, a US Navy gunboat on the Yangtze River, did not bode well diplomatically, as it gave new resonance to the image of Japan as a direct threat to American security. The various aggressions and violations of other sovereignties was eventually met by an American pre-war policy of containment that eventually became more dynamic. After Japan occupied southern French Indochina in August 31, Roosevelt declared he could not tolerate Japan's advance by armed force and would not continue meetings unless Japan's expansionist activities were stopped. As a part of their containment strategy, the US imposed trade restrictions of increasing severity against Japan. To summarize some major economic actions against Japan, in 1938 there was a moral embargo on export of aircraft, armaments, and so on. In 1939, the moral embargo was expanded, now including information and equipment relating to producing high-quality aviation gasoline, for instance. In October 1940, all exports of iron and steel scrap were restricted. On 26th July 1941, Japanese assets in the US were frozen, effectively terminating all trade between the two nations. Considering that US was a very important trade partner for Japan, as Asta touched upon, the freeze and prior sanctions had repercussions both economically and militarily. Japanese procurement of all American petroleum products declined steadily from 33.2 million barrels in 1938 to 24.9 million barrels in 1940, then sharply to 12.6 million in the first 7 months of 1941. Japan's oil stockpile had declined from 51.4 million barrels in April 1939 to 48.9 million barrels in April 1941. The total value of major U.S. exports dropped from $227 million in 1940 to $59.9 million in 1941. To further exacerbate, there was a lack of alternate trade partners for Japan, as other countries such as Britain, France, and the Netherlands were saving resources for their war efforts and willing to coordinate economic sanctions with the US against Japan. This thus brings us full circle back to Asta's points on the shortages, how that led to conflict with the US and the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan's circumstances were dire and set in motion by decades of prior socio-political developments that transformed their governance, military, and society at large. These factors cannot be discounted when discussing the motivations for the attack.
I feel enlightened. I was aware of Japanese aggression in China, how the economic sanctions affected Japan and made them rationalize the commencement of hostilities with Western powers. But I was less familiar with their political developments and had not thought to make a strong connection between all these different happenings.
It feels like their shortage was self-inflicted. I mean, Japan was still able to conduct trade, but they just had to isolate themselves diplomatically and economically from the other powers.
There indeed is an argument that the shortage or the severity thereof was self-induced. In the early years of industrializing economy, Japan was still a net exporter of natural resource commodities. While the import-export ratio for minerals eventually reached 2.5 to 1 on average during 1917 to 1926, which reflected a somewhat heavier strain on natural resources, Japanese industry still succeeded tremendously in conserving raw materials and fuels. Thus, no serious problem arose until 1930. As an example, the consumption of coking coal per ton of pig iron produced was reduced from 1.6 or 1.7 tons. The policy of imperialistic expansion based on military buildup and the resultant expansion of heavy industries tremendously increased demand for natural resources. Hence, the previously non-existent shortage of natural resources eventually became real. To give some numbers, between 1932 and 1940, the relative price of imports rose as much as 68.7%. Coal and iron ore were chart toppers in this regard, with a 203% and 80% increase respectively. Hence, the military buildup and imperialistic expansion started to look necessary.
It seems that the Japanese were fond of their circular reasoning or creating problems for themselves. Well, thanks guys for the wonderful insight. I'm sure we have all learned something today. Is there anything else to discuss before we move on to the consequences of the Pearl Harbor attack for the Pacific theater?
Yeah, I think it will be interesting to shed some light on the industrial output of the United States versus Japan. This was a significant hill to overcome to Japan, on top of what I previously shared regarding the resource shortage. For example, in 1940, production of ingot steel in the United States was 61 million metric tons. In Japan, it was 7.5 million metric tons instead. As Haley Paul Wilmot pointed out, even if during the Pearl Harbour attack the Imperial Navy had been able to sink every major unit of the entire United States Navy, and then complete its own construction programs without losing a single unit. By mid-1944, it would still not have been able to put sea a fleet equal to the one the Americans could have assembled in the intervening 30 months. Of course, the Americans held the advantage in far more than just shipbuilding, as they churned out 47.8 thousand military aircraft to Japan's 8.8 thousand in 1942. Even if only a third of that was allocated to the Pacific Theater, the United States could still add almost double the number of aircraft compared to Japan. This stark difference in industry and war output is something Japan almost certainly would have known of, just from the fact that multiple officers such as Yamamoto Isoroku, Nagano Osamu, and former Admiral turned Ambassador Nomura were all once naval attached in Washington. The contrast further reinforced the notion provided by other issues such as lack of the fuel that the Japanese must pull the trigger and take a shot at Pearl Harbour with haste. Well, they still stand a chance.
Since Ambassador Nomura was brought up, that reminds me that it is relevant to mention the breakdown in negotiations between the US and Japan as some sort of last straw that ruled out further Japanese attempts at diplomacy. In February 1941, Nomura arrived at Washington and met with Roosevelt soon after. In the following months, a series of discussions would be conducted. However, they failed to show any promise of successful conclusion, as neither party would barge on important issues such as the China incident. There were also the failed negotiations with the Dutch, which commenced in September 1940 and ended in June 1941, as the Dutch were not willing to make concessions and allow Japan to procure oil. Hence, Japan had exhausted all except a military solution.
As Karl von Clausewitz wrote, war is nothing but the continuation of politics by other means. Thank you everyone for the wonderful insights thus far. Let's briefly recap the factors that led Japan to attack Pearl Harbour. Japan had developed into a nationalist and imperialist state centered around the emperor. Simultaneously, the conditions were ripe for the military to become too politically powerful, and any attempts to restore subordination were feeble. That set the stage for Japanese expansion in Asia. Subsequently, they struggled to meet their military and industrial demand for resources, which was both a justification for and caused by their aggression. When that led to increasing economic sanctions, which could only exacerbate Japan's circumstances, war with the Western powers was their only solution. They perceived a quick war followed by negotiated peace to be the best outcome, even if slim. The attack on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbour to neutralize Japan's greatest threat was thus conceived as part of their opening chess moves. What were the consequences of the attack? Was there a blunder? Find out shortly after the break. There has been a boatload of information thus far, and there is more to come. Shall we resume by discussing the immediate effects of the attack on Pearl Harbour?
On paper, the attack did severe damage. The Japanese strike force of 353 aircraft launched from 4 carriers consisted of 274 torpedo and bomber planes, destroyed or damaged 19 United States ships, including 8 battleships and 339 aircraft. This also resulted in 2,403 casualties for the United States.
Why do you say on paper? Is this attack not disastrous for the US?
John Mueller argues that it was an inconvenience instead. Many authors have characterized Pearl Harbour as the worst military disaster in the United States history, devastating a catastrophe, for instance. In 1941, the word was still accustomed to measuring sea power in terms of battleships. Hence, it was easy to embellish the impact of the attack. The damage was insignificant as those 8 battleships were old and launched at least 2 decades earlier. Hence, considerable modernization was required, and in fact, 4 of them were due to be officially declared overage in 1942. Wilmot observed that the attack removed from the scene some ships of rather questionable value and forced the Americans to recast the whole of their tactical doctrine. Furthermore, Pearl Harbor's shallow waters of about 9-meter depth outside the channels meant that ships, even if sunk, could be readily repaired. Ultimately, this meant that only 2 battleships out of the entire harbor fleet of over 100 were a total loss, and they were to be declared overage. In fact, apart from those 2 battleships, all other ships struck in the attack managed to participate in various naval battles throughout the war. Thus, while still considered a Japanese tactical success, the ships were out of action for a relatively short duration. Hence, from a long-term perspective, the overall losses and the military impact of Pearl Harbor are over-dramatized.
I'd like to chime in on this with something that I find somewhat intriguing. The Japanese practiced shallow torpedo attacks in 1939, even before the British attack at Taranto in November 1940. They even engineered variations of their aerial torpedo, developed new attack technique and tactics to overcome difficulties associated with the attacks in shallow waters, which were used successfully at Pearl Harbor. Yet, it did not occur to them that maybe the attack won't be as meaningful, since the US could possibly repair all the ships with relative ease, as Asta mentioned above. Nevertheless, the US industrial capacity meant that even if all the American ships were sunk for good, as Asta previously quoted Wilmot, the Americans would by mid-1944 have assembled a fleet better than what the Japanese could have, even if the Japanese lost none and completed whichever ships they started building. Furthermore, the 300-plus American aircraft lost at Pearl Harbor would have been replaced with superior planes in less than 3 days at 1942 rates of aircraft production.
It is also important to mention that, both crucially and luckily, the 3 aircraft carriers of the United States Pacific Fleet were all not present at Pearl Harbor and hence left intact. The carrier would prove to be the major naval weapon in the Pacific War. Hence, this coincidence was impactful for both the United States and Japan. Other targets that were left completely or mostly unscathed include extensive shore facilities, the tremendous oil storage that was filled, and a considerable number of cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Furthermore, the United States Navy was not ready to interfere with Japanese operations across southern East Asia anyway, and in fact was surprised by the attack as they thought it was unnecessary. There was a lack of numbers, advanced bases, and overall supplies, as Admiral Richardson, Pacific Fleet Commander-in-Chief, noted in the summer of 1940, concluding that 2 years of build-up before 2 years of hard fighting was necessary to win. Hence, all these factors combined mean that the military significance of Pearl Harbor was much milder than perceived.
Thank you both for the analysis regarding the attack's military impact. However, I don't suppose that the American public's reaction was to shrug it off and go, no big deal, we'll repair them eventually.
The attack riled up the United States, and Congress declared to enter the war with only one dissenting vote. Congresswoman Janet Rankin was a pacifist and had previously voted against entering World War I as well. America officially declared war against Japan on December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. 3 days later, it declared war against Germany in response to Hitler's declaration of war.
A decade after the war, a Japanese admiral had a humorous response to being asked if he had received any medals from the emperor for the Pearl Harbor attack. He said, "On the contrary, I should have received medals from the American side rather than from the emperor. Otherwise, the United States would not have been united as one people for war." I'd agree with the admiral's assessment, given that previously foreign policy was hotly debated in the US. President Roosevelt had to battle isolationists for the modifications to the Neutrality Acts and the Lend-Lease Act. The foremost isolationist organization in the US was the America First Committee, which had over 800,000 members. However, Pearl Harbor saw the isolationists rally to war. Prominent leader of the America First Committee, Charles Lindbergh, said, "War has come and we must meet as united Americans regardless of our attitude in the past toward the policy our government has followed." Thus, the attack did result in the US coalescing to fight Japan.
Another American response towards Pearl Harbor attack was the internment of Japanese Americans. From the 1920s and 30s onwards, the United States had been taking note of the large population of Japanese immigrants living in Hawaii. Roosevelt suggested to Chief of Naval Operations on August 10, 1936, to compile a special list of those who would be the first to be placed in concentration camp in the event of trouble. The Office of Naval Intelligence, Military Intelligence Division were some agencies that gathered and assessed information regarding Japanese populations. And during Pearl Harbor, the Army with the FBI to round up all persons on the detention list. Within 24 hours, 1,000 Japanese aliens had been apprehended, and within a week, a total of 300 alien enemies of German, Italian, and Japanese nationality were in the custody of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. There was a growing clamor on the West Coast for the immediate internment, and undoubtedly racism played a role. The Japanese, even those born in America and thus citizens, were characterized as not being real Americans and of being a dangerous fifth column of potential spies and traitors. This is evidenced by FBI agents arresting all persons of Japanese ancestry on the list, regardless of their custodial detention status. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, instituting the greatest planned and controlled migration in history, the movement of the American Japanese. As a result, about 110,000 people, Japanese Americans on the West Coast, were relocated, most to inland concentration camps.
Thank you for sharing about this obscure happening. I've not heard about it before. I imagine the ordeal must have been an alienating experience for the immigrants who will be grappling with their identity more than ever.
I'd also chime in with another lesser-known event that occurred post-Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, the US were eager to exact revenge upon Japan. Roosevelt demanded the military find ways and means of carrying home to Japan proper in the form of bombing raid, the meaning of war. The Doolittle raid was conducted in April 1942 when bombers would take off from carriers on a one-way trip to strike Tokyo. This was somewhat ad hoc as the B-25 Mitchell bombers weren't designed for carriers and the issue of where to land was never properly addressed. To me, this shows the American desire for vengeance as they were willing to embark on this high-risk mission. The Japanese could not believe that the Doolittle raid was successful, and Yamamoto himself took quarters aboard battleship Nagato and was crippled by anxiety and depression. Furthermore, did you know that the raid, which was the U.S. revenge for Pearl Harbor, also led to the pivotal Battle of the Midway? The Japanese sought to extend their defensive perimeter to prevent any more attacks on the homelands and to obtain a decisive victory over the U.S. forces as per their traditional naval doctrine. The carriers were in proximity of Midway when the B-25 bombers took off from them for Tokyo. Thus, Yamamoto planned to lure the U.S. fleet out to the American-controlled atoll, kill two birds with one stone, and even set up a future conquest of Hawaii with Midway as the launch pad. The Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, also known as Station Hypo, was stationed in Pearl Harbor's administration building, which ironically was untouched on 7th December. On May 5th, 1942, they intercepted and decrypted an order to attack the Aleutian Islands and the codename AH. Their commando, Joseph Rochefort, had a hunch that it was Midway, but superiors did not. Nevertheless, a ruse was plotted, and they openly broadcasted a false distress call regarding their distillation plant. Japanese intelligence on Wake Island relayed the information, confirming that AH was indeed Midway. The US thus had full knowledge of the Japanese attack, down to the timing, distance, and bearing at the point of contact, and that contributed to their victory, costing Japan 4 carriers and 322 planes. This turn of events from Pearl Harbour to the Doolittle raid and Midway proves that the Pearl Harbour attack had an opposite effect on American morale than what Yamamoto predicted, which was that the Americans would be too demoralized and not persist on in fighting. If anything, ironically, the attack set off this chain of events that led to a pivotal defeat for Japan.
It's just like what that Japanese admiral said about deserving American medals instead. Pearl Harbour truly did spur the Americans on. I imagine that perhaps partly due to that, the US was able to rapidly mobilize people and industry for the war effort.
Prior to Pearl Harbor, the United States had a relatively small military, and in 1940, only 1% of the working population was in the armed force. By comparison, that figure was 2.8% for the United Kingdoms in 1939. By 1943, the number grew 16 times, and the overall war-related workforce went from 9.4% in 1940 to 35.4% in 1943. Initially, only a fraction of required raw materials were produced. For instance, a new synthetic rubber industry was started from scratch, since natural rubber sources were cut off after the war started. The improved resource management and conservation combined with rationing to more efficiently produce and allocate various goods as needed to meet both military and civilian needs. The focus of the economy gradually shifted towards reinforcing industrial and military capabilities. The industrial mobilization of the United States for World War II was the largest part of the $304.4 billion in defense expenditures, which from 1940 to 1942 increased almost 30-fold. In these first years, the building of capacity like plants, factories, shipyards, etc. consumed 30% of the defense expenditures. Over the subsequent 4 years, the government was to spend approximately $3.8 billion on weapons research and development, spread readily among both the top research universities, including $2 billion for the Manhattan Project. In retrospect, the comparable industrial economies would be tested in their respective capacities in 5 distinct and related industries: shipbuilding, aircraft, artillery or armor, construction and electronic equipment. The advancements in these industrial sectors bolstered the military prowess of the United States, rendering it a formidable force in warfare, encompassing weapon manufacturing and technological research.
I think it is also worth noting that although Pearl Harbor can be considered a catalyst that expedited the coming together of American society for the war effort, the industrial production of the US should not be considered a miracle. It was as expected given their pre-war technological industrial base and population. Paul Koistinen argues that from the perspective of pre-war potential and when compared with other belligerents, America's World War II munitions production effort was not outstanding.
We've discussed earlier how the Japanese thought that they were superior and stood a chance, but their overconfidence only compounded with other mistakes to turn the tides of war.
I'm inclined to agree. It was certainly a very impactful and defining event, just from the fact that it kickstarted the Pacific War, so in that regard it was very consequential. However, it was insignificant in attaining an eventual Japanese victory. From our discussion thus far, I think we can establish that Japan poked a half away and now angry grizzly bear that is the United States. And they had just one can of ineffective bear spray. The attack on Pearl Harbor was executed well, yet almost all ships hit were eventually combat ready, and unlike Japanese expectations, the United States, though shocked, were far from defeatist. Their hopes for a quick war were dashed, and the Allies would whittle them down in the next almost 4 years.
More like Japan wished they had a full can, but they started their camping trip with a quarter, and it ran out when the bear barely began charging at them. Their logistical challenges were just another set of problems unaddressed, another nail or four in the coffin. As General John Pershing said, infantry win battles, logistics win wars. Even before Pearl Harbor, there was a shortage of ammunition. The Japanese Navy's stockpile had only up to 30% of protected aerial torpedoes and 20mm aircraft cannon rounds needed, and their current production was slow as well. Hence, after the start of the war, the Navy was haunted by ammunition shortages. The manpower situation was not better, as their manpower policies could not replace the combat losses of middle-ranking officers, and was suited for a short war based on a decisive battle, not the war for attrition that ended up happening. And for all the thirst for oil that contributed to the attack and the entire war, Japan at the end of second year of the war had a deficit of 1.29 billion liters already. Both the Navy and Cabinet Planning Board consistently overestimated their supply and underestimated their consumption. Obviously, the oil from the Southeast Asia had to be shipped back to Japan and other territories. Although Japan's tanker tonnage grew from 120,000 tons in 1934 to 364,000 tons in 1940, thus quadrupling the annual carrying capacity to 4 million tons in 1940, that was still inadequate for Japan's needs. And if one looked at a map, it would be equally obvious that the convoys would have to traverse vast oceans and seas between Japan and its Southeast Asian holdings. One need to be on admiral to understand the potential vulnerability of these shipping lanes. Both during and after World War I, the Japanese Navy kept itself informed on allied anti-submarine tactics and technologies, making reports, holding lectures and exercises. But all these did not spark interest in the Navy, and they did not concretely implement any effective protection for their merchant shipping. Their ill-preparedness in outlook, doctrine, training, ships, and equipment to deal with either commerce, protection, or anti-submarine warfare led to a reduction in Japan's merchant shipping to 1.5 million tons at war's end versus a pre-war total of 6.4 million tons, severely degrading not just the Navy's operational capabilities, but Japan's war machine as a whole. To conclude, these unaddressed logistical issues exacerbated the difference in industry between the US and Japan. Though Pearl Harbor was a successful attack on paper, the effect on the US fighting capabilities was minimal. Roosevelt himself said that even if the attack had not been made, it was not feasible to conduct offensive operations towards the Philippines while island bases were under Japanese control. All Japan did was to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve.
Thank you everyone for the insights on Japan's oversights. I have one final question before we can hopefully wrap up. We have established that the odds of victory for Japan were slim, to say the least. A key moment that defined the outbreak of hostilities was Pearl Harbor, and another highly significant event happened at the very end of the Pacific War. What are your opinions on the relation between Pearl Harbor and the atomic bombings of Japan by the United States?
One could argue that the Pearl Harbor attack affected the course of the entire war. The attack affected especially the attitudes that Americans had towards the Japanese. The memory of Pearl Harbor stayed in the minds of American people and caused hatred towards Japanese. In using the bomb, the United States then President Harry Truman succumbed to the raging hate rooted in a long history of animosity against the Japanese, as well as the fierce memory of Pearl Harbor. Broadcasted on the same day as the second atomic bombing, a portion of Truman's radio address regarding the Potsdam Conference reads, "We have used the bomb against those who attack us without warning at Pearl Harbor. To me, it is clear that There was a psychological factor stemming from Pearl Harbour at playing in the bombings. Even if Pearl Harbour was far from the bloodiest or most militarily impactful of battles in the Pacific.
I concur. There were a lot of aspects behind Truman's decision on using the atomic bombs, but many scholars argue that the sense of revenge widely shared by the American public indeed affected his decision to stick to dropping the bomb. After receiving criticism for the use of the atomic bombs, Truman's defense was that he was greatly disturbed by the unwarranted attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor and referred to Japan as a beast that needs to be treated as such.
Obviously, there were also both military and political aspects in use of atomic bombs. The president's official statements in the aftermath of the bombings emphasized the fact that the atomic bombs were used to end the war as soon as possible and to save the lives of thousands of young Americans. The United States had to decide between invading the Japanese home islands, risking millions of casualties, or using the atomic bomb to compel Japanese surrender by shocking their leadership. Truman and his advisors viewed the bomb as lesser of two evils. The political state of the world and growing tension between the Soviet Union and the United States played a significant role in the decision. The tension between these two nations had been growing throughout the war, despite their nominal alliance against the Axis powers. The United States wanted to end the war quickly to prevent the Soviet invasion of Japan and possible Soviet control over parts of Asia. All these aspects contributed to the United States in the decision on using atomic bombs.
Perhaps ironically, through Hiroshima, Truman inadvertently made Stalin more wary of the US contributing to the start of the Cold War.
Earlier, you mentioned the planned American invasion of Japanese home islands. Could you briefly share more about that?
Yeah, of course. Operation Downfall was a planned invasion of the Japanese home islands that was supposed to begin in November of 1945 and expected to last until May 1947. The operation consisted of two parts. The first part, Operation Olympic, would have been the invasion of Japan's southernmost home island, Kyushu. Operation Coronet would target the Canton Plain near Tokyo. Many battles in the Pacific theater were brutal, and the Americans expected the invasion of Japan to be no different. President Truman wanted to avoid a second Okinawa, where the casualty rate was 35%. But now in all of Japan, estimates of casualties range from 40,000 to 1 million. Japanese defenses would have been tough, and the civilian militia would have been primitively armed. However, this invasion was not needed when Japan informed the elite of its intention to surrender on August 15, 1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan.
I think any discussion revolving around the atomic bombings, Operation Downfall, Soviet declaration, and the surrender will always have uncertainty and different angles. Even immediately after the bombings and Soviet declaration of war, people still clung to the hope of a final victory. On the other hand, the bombings and Soviet declaration gave the Japanese leadership a face-saving excuse to surrender, which may be corroborated by many interviews with the Japanese officials, which indicated that the bomb played an essential role in prompting surrender. Yet, according to the final report of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey published in 1946, Japan would have surrendered without the use of atomic bombs, Soviet entry into the war, or an American invasion of Kyushu. To conclude, the Pearl Harbor attack did affect the atomic bombings decision and made it possible in the first place. Likewise, though Operation Downfall was not executed, Pearl Harbor was a catalyst that made it possible to plan the invasion. And had it been conducted, I think that the Americans would have stepped foot on Japan proper with Pearl Harbor still in mind.
Thank you all for the extensive discussions today. I'm sure everyone has learned plenty. I shall try to summarize succinctly. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a portion of the Japanese Southern Strategy. Japan had to secure key resources across Southeast Asia, especially since they are under increasing economic sanctions. They thought attacking Pearl Harbour would prevent the US Pacific Fleet from interfering by inflicting decisive damage, and that the US would be inclined to negotiate peace and concede to Japanese hegemony in Asia. The backdrop to these circumstances involves a tumultuous period in Japanese history, characterized by intense militarism, nationalism, and emperor worship. However, the impact of Pearl Harbour was, in general, contrary to Japanese expectations. Permanent damage inflicted was confined to two rather obsolete battleships of a fleet lacking in operational capability anyway. Psychologically, it lit a fire under the US instead of decimating their fighting spirit. Other non-military effects include the subsequent internment of Japanese in the US. Pearl Harbor's goal of limiting the duration of the war by dealing strong material and morale losses to achieve negotiated peace was not achieved. Instead, over the next 4 years, Japan would slog it out in Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, etc., and received 2 atomic bombs before the capitulation. Thus, the attack was in multiple ways consequential and influential, just not in the manner the Japanese hoped for. As Hirohito described on 15 August 1945, the war has not necessarily developed in our favor. With that, I shall conclude today's episode. Thank you to our viewers for tuning in today, to our guest speakers Asta and Pauliina. I hope to see you next time. Bye bye!